Hey everyone, you're here with Mark on Perfect Gardens TV. So today we got a great question. What stage should calcium be added then, and in what form is the best? Today we'll be talking about the different types of calcium, why problems start with calcium, and how to fix the problem. So let's go ahead and get into it. Okay, so types of calcium. We have calcium carbonate, found in agriculture, lime. It is used to neutralize soil acidity. Calcium sulfate, also known as gypsum, improves soil structure, drainage, and provides both calcium and sulfur. Calcium nitrate, a highly soluble form of calcium that is used in hydroponics and as fertilizer to supply calcium and nitrogen. Calcium chloride addresses calcium deficiencies as a foliar spray. Calcium ammonium nitrate, fertilizer that provides calcium and nitrogen to plants. Calcium chelates, calcium EDTA, that make calcium more readily available in certain soil conditions, especially in alkaline soils. Calcium acetate, used in certain specialized agriculture applications. And calcium phosphate, fertilizer that provides calcium and phosphorus. Okay, right? So there's all kinds of different types of calcium that you can provide to agriculture. And why do each of them make it? I'll give you a couple of examples. Like why does calcium sulfate help improve soil structure versus calcium carbonate is more used to neutralize soil acidity? Well, I'll just give you a couple examples, and we're not going to go too heavy into all these. But calcium carbonate, what's going to happen is it's actually going to release CO2 as it's breaking down, because it's not 100% calcium, right? Like calcium sulfate. And so what's going to happen is it's going to release the CO2, and as it releases the CO2, it's going to increase to a higher alkaline, more neutralizing it to 7, around the 7 pH range, and that's why it's going to help neutralize the acidic soils. Calcium sulfate, the reason why that one helps improves drainage and soil structures, because bacteria love sulfur. The reason why drops balance works so well as well in relationship to bacteria is because bacteria love sulfates, and that's why it's going to help soil structures, because in this situation, it's already fully broken down. No CO2 is going to get released, so it's not going to adjust the pH. And bacteria love the sulfur, so they're going to go in there and help reestablish the microfibers that help hold on to trace minerals as further things break down. Calcium nitrate, they've designed a fertilizer where you have calcium and nitrogen. Calcium chloride, same thing. All these different calciums, as you begin to get away from calcium carbonate and calcium sulfate, there are different types of calcium that where they got the isolated calcium and they got nitrogen, and they spliced it together in different forms. Even they have a couple different ones right here that provide ammonium nitrate versus just nitrate, right? So these different types of cocktails of calcium to provide so that there's a better uptake of calcium, because they have identified that you need calcium for cellular structure and for everything, vegetative growth, blooming, and a variety of other things. So once again, what calcium do you pick when you have so many things? And this is where I actually don't really like to identify a specific type of chemical. I actually just like to create a solution, because no matter what way you go in this direction, they're all providing a high concentration of a specific type of mineral or two specific types of chemicals, which ends up throwing off a couple laws that we're going to get into in a few seconds. So let's go real quick though and talk about quick identifiers you need to understand about understanding when problems arise with calcium. First, if you have a lack of calcium, you're going to have stunted growth and your flowers are going to be stunted. You're also going to possibly see yellow spots. And if you have an excess of calcium, it locks out potassium, iron, magnesium, and manganese, right? So if you too little, it's going to stun it. And if you have too much, it's going to lock other things out. Excess of phosphorus potassium will actually lock out calcium, magnesium, iron, and zinc, and it actually elongates new growth. It's one of the main identifiers. And you're going to understand why I'm explaining all of these things in a second. And the final thing is your VPD. If your VPD is off for more than 6 hours in your grow room, you will see signs of calcium deficiency. More often than not, as I pointed out all these things except for an excess of calcium, all these things show up as a calcium deficiency, right? Obviously, the first one's going to be because you're lacking calcium, but the VPD and the excess of phosphorus potassium, they show up as you lacking potassium, but that's not the case. It's just calcium is being locked out. But all these various things play a major part in dealing with two laws. And the important thing is being able to identify very quickly when you're actually having a lack of calcium versus when you're having calcium being locked out. Or even if you have an excess of calcium, identifying that it could be locking out other things. And you don't want to be adding in things that is showing up as a deficiency but it's really a lockout because it'll only create a slipperier slope around going back to a harmonious state back into your soil system where your soil biology can begin to work and function properly. So all these different things of being excess or not enough, it all deals with something called the law of tolerance, right? And it's really easy to understand. When you have the ideal growing environments, that's when you're going to have the largest plants. But if it gets too hot or one mineral or a couple minerals, fertilizers begin to be too much or too little, you have a smaller and smaller growth, and to the point where if you don't fix the problem, it's going to kill the plants and nothing's going to grow. So that's dealing with one major law. What I think you really have to understand when dealing with calcium in its liquid form, because what you're doing is you're adding in a high concentration of one mineral. And when you increase the high concentration of one mineral, like we showed you, it can very well lock out other things. And also, calcium can show up as a deficiency when there is no deficiency, but it's just being locked out over a small moment in time. And we're kind of stressing out about stuff we're seeing that happened the day before or 2 days before, but it might not even be the current case or current situation you're dealing with. The next thing is dealing with the law of minimum, right? How do you solve the problem? The law of minimum states that plant growth is limited by the scarcest essential nutrient available. So as we go through this presentation, I'm going to explain to you how I solved the problem with one specific procedure. And there's small variations, but it really doesn't matter if you're dealing with excess in phosphorus and potassium or drybacks, or if you're dealing with any situation, the same procedure pretty much always follows. So the trace minerals are the most limiting factor after consistent watering and soil biology are reestablished. Drops Balance has 100 trace minerals. These two things are pretty important on following through on actually solving the problem. So how to fix the problem? Very first, most important thing when I'm dealing with my grow clients is I first check, is it a VPD issue? Because if your VPD is off for only 6 hours, 6 to 8 hours, because these plants grow so fast, if the water isn't flowing and the calcium isn't flowing, you're going to see little brown dots where it looks like you're having a calcium deficiency. But what's actually happening is as the plant's growing, even on the older growth, and that's really where you're going to see this primarily, this is actually how you know you're not having a calcium deficiency problem very quickly, is when you see this damage happening in the older growth versus the newer growth. Because if you were actually having a calcium deficiency problem, the whole plant would be stunted. But because the plant's still growing, what's happening is it's taking mobile nutrients, or it's taking nutrients that it still has certain amounts of it, and it's like, okay, there's not enough calcium to create new cellular structure in the older growth, so we're going to send it up to the newer growth as calcium's flowing through the xylem in the plant, right? So because you have a VPD issue and calcium stops flowing because of literally the weight of the molecule of calcium as it's flowing up the xylem, and that can be thrown off, like I said, by VPD or by even temperature. These two things could create a sign where it shows a calcium deficiency in the older growth. But like I said, what's actually happening is it's just sending the new calcium that does have available to it up to the newest growth so the plant can keep growing. A lot of times what will happen is growers will start to add in more CalMag in this situation to amend the problem versus fixing their VPD issue. And the VPD issue normally happens when the lights are turning on or off, or just a period of time where the lights are turning, like I said, turning on or off, and it changes the humidity of the room. And if it happens too long, it throws the VPD off and things stop flowing. Point is that a lot of growers will go get CalMag and they'll start adding in more of that macro mineral of calcium or magnesium. If you throw in too much calcium, it starts to lock out all these other minerals, and then you start creating a cascading effect versus you should have looked at how your air was moving or circulating through your room. The second thing, right, is okay, you've identified it's not a VPD issue. So now you've identified that it is an actual calcium deficiency problem. At that point, you're going to want to go get a simple liquid calcium magnesium. You could use eggshells and vinegar and break it down that way. I believe it's calcium acetate, if I remember straight. And what you're doing is you're water solubilizing calcium and giving it to the plant. The issue is, though, if you give too much of it, or you don't know how much to give because you just start doing something, it could start to lock out other minerals. So it's just something to kind of be aware of. The third step is what I take with my growers is I always try to see a bigger picture of the plant. If the new growth is elongating and it's getting skinny and elongated, that's a clear sign of having too much phosphorus and potassium. And when you have too much phosphorus and potassium, and this can normally happen because if you're using in hydroponics, the plants are taking up a lot of water and they're leaving behind certain salts. Even though phosphorus and potassium are very water soluble, if the plant's taking up more water than the other salts, then excess begins to build, and you begin to see signs of this through the elongating of the new growth. And potentially you start to see a lockout of calcium, magnesium, iron, and zinc because of excess of phosphorus and potassium. How I normally recommend my growers to do this, instead of going and doing a complete reservoir change because it's expensive, I recommend for them to add in trace minerals. Because when you add in trace minerals, just like I said, the scarcest resource is what unlocks the rest of everything else. Instead of adding in more calcium and magnesium, we boost up the trace minerals. And when you boost up the trace minerals, it makes all the other nutrients more available, right? Obviously, you're going to also want to make sure to figure out a way to keep your water reservoir at the same water level consistently as well, so that the salts don't keep building up as water gets taken up by the plants. The next thing I recommend is, if you are using a living system, is I recommend to add in BAM. BAM has 83 bacteria in it. What happens is when the salts build up, your parts per million increase. And when your parts per million increase and goes past 900, the bacteria begin to go dormant. So I recommend to re-inoculate with a precursor bacteria, and that's normally why I recommend the BAM, and it stands for badass microbes. And those bacteria are precursor bacteria. So it doesn't matter what stage the plants are in, it's reintroducing bacteria that will adjust very quickly to whatever stage the plants are in, versus adding in bacteria that have already been designed for a vegetative state or breaking down phosphorus, or is meant for a flowering state for potassium or something. I like putting in precursor fermented bacteria versus bacteria, like I said, have already been engineered for specific things at certain stages. And because the bacteria have become dormant, it's important to re-inoculate your environment with active bacteria again. Then the next situation is, it leads into normally the second situation is a dryback of salt because of the infrequency of watering. And more often than not, just because phosphorus and potassium are very water soluble. So that also means that when there's drybacks, these salts are going to be some of the first that are left behind actually and go back into a salt form. And so when that happens, a lot of times what growers will do, they'll start to see some type of a funky growth of some level, like it just doesn't make sense. And plants are drying out, so they're droopy. They're also going through plant deficiencies because the salts are being locked out. And what's going to happen is a lot of growers will they'll be like, oh man, I need a water, or they'll put in an excess of water. What's going to happen is it ends up dissolving those phosphorus and potassium. And you go from having droopy, sickly plants that are malnourished because of nutrient lockout to now an excess of phosphorus and potassium because they dissolve the salts around the pot, making them water soluble, and then it fries the crop, and then the grower more often than not will flush the plant, and then it will strip the soil of all the nutrients, and then the plant starts to cannibalize itself, and it starts to become malnourished. And this happens really quickly. It happens all the time, actually. And what we've done to mitigate this problem is, when you do have a dryback period, to not flush your plants, but to actually do a very slow water with a small amount of water and frequently water your plants over a 30 to 45 minute period. And you're going to want to water it with drops balance and with BAM. That's going to help break surface tension throughout your entire pot, because you want to evenly dissolve these salts as quickly as possible. You want the bacteria to start to become active, so they become selective what the plant needs again. And then you're going to end up dissolving enough water of these salts to slightly flush them out of your soil, but you're only going to slowly water with a high frequency. So you might end up watering, depending on the size of your pot. You know, if you have a small pot, it might be 60 ounces of water. If you have a larger pot, you might start off with 32 ounces of water, and then you repeat giving another 32 ounces or whatever every 15 minutes until it slowly breaks the surface tension, dissolves salts, and then you're going to want about 10 to 20% of that water to come out the bottom. And that should dissolve enough salts where the excess salts flush slightly out of your system, but not enough to the point where your plant starts to cannibalize itself. And you're going to flush enough out to the point where it doesn't take up the phosphorus and potassium first, because those are very water soluble, right? So they're going to take them up first, dissolving them and getting some of those out of the system first. And you're going to repeat this process of a slow water for about 2, maybe 3 days. 2 days is normally enough. And then at that point, you'll get back onto your normal feeding schedule. You might also want to reduce your phosphorus to potassium or be more consistent in your watering practice, because normally it's one of those two reasons why excess phosphorus or potassium will build up. These are the primary reasons why people will see a calcium deficiency sign, and it's not a calcium deficiency. It's only because of a lockout. And when you follow this procedure of doing the slow water process and going back on it, you're going to end up reducing your phosphorus potassium use again, or fix your watering practice. Then you'll probably want to either raise your lights a little bit or reduce the amount of power, like dim them down 10-15%. And that's going to help alleviate some of the stress, because like I said, the phosphorus potassium will be the first things that the plants take up. And if you do that for just a couple days, the plant will bounce back within 3 or 4 days, versus it going through this radical slippery slope of problems for 7 to 10 days, up to 2 weeks, or maybe it gets so bad to the point where the plant never recovers. Guys, I hope this presentation was helpful. I always recommend to check out Drops of Balance and BAM. Those two products help solve a lot of problems of what's going on in the industry. Thanks so much, and have a great grow, everyone.